Hi everyone, today we're going to learn about the Temple of Amun-Re. This you may have heard of before because yesterday we looked at the Temple of Hatshepsut, and this is the temple that they were talking about in the video, is lined up on the axis with Hatshepsut's temple. So she built that temple to line up with this very, very important temple across the Nile River. So let's start with form. This word should be a review. So you can see here that the Temple of Amun-Re includes post and lintel construction. And we talked about that when we looked at Stonehenge. Remember, the posts are the columns that go upward, and then the lintel are the stones that sit on top. So you can see that at the top here, where there's two columns supporting the stones above. That's post and lintel construction. Another thing that you can put for form is that the Temple of Amun-Re is on an axial plan. And we talked about that with the Temple of Hatshepsut. So an axial plan, again, is when everything is aligned along one main line or axis. And it's almost kind of mirrored on either side of that. So the Temple of Amun-Re is another one that has an axial plan. So let's shift and talk a little bit about context. So the Temple of Amun-Re, you can see here, is right by the Nile River. This was in the capital called Thebes, and the capital shifted over time, but this site is called Thebes. It's also called Karnak, which you see there, K-A-R-N-A-K. And Amun-Re was one of the most important gods because he's associated with the sun and a lot of other things. He's a really, really important god to the Egyptians. And this was considered the place, or one of the places where that god actually dwelled and lived. Another thing we learned about with Hatshepsut is that they had processional festivals, and I'll talk about this a little bit more as I go through some of the other slides. But there was a statue of Amun-Re in this temple that they would take out, and they would take him on what they called a ceremonial bark, which is on the vocabulary, a ceremonial bark, which is a boat, and they would sail him across the Nile, and he would visit places like the Temple of Hatshepsut. So the fact that this temple was on this axis and had these straight paths going in and out, those would have been used also for festival routes, not just for people coming and going, but they would be the main directions of these festival processions. Another thing I would add for context, and I'll show you this as we go as well, is that this complex was added to over a long period of time by different pharaohs. And another thing we learned when we studied Hatshepsut was that she had all of these buildings erected and all of these statues made, and she was very interested in producing art, but it was for a reason. It was for political power. And so other pharaohs added to this site, the Temple of Amun-Re, to also show their political power and also show that they were the rightful rulers by honoring the god Amun-Re. So now let's talk about content. So if you were a person arriving at the temple, you would pass through one of the causeways, which was lined with sphinxes, like you see here. So you would pass through this sphinx-lined walkway that extended from the temple towards the Nile River. The next thing that you would encounter are the pylons. And the pylons are here. They're like huge stone gates almost. And you can see, if you look closely, that you'd enter through a series of pylons. So you can see the sphinx-lined walkway, and then you'd enter through this first pylon. But there were many, many more after that. So there are these huge stone structures, and this complex is actually divided by 10 different pylons in different sections. But definitely, the pylons give the impression of something very intimidating and awe-inspiring, which is what you would want for one of the most powerful gods in the Egyptian pantheon. Here's another view of the ruins of the pylons today, and they are supposed to symbolize the horizon and the sun rising between two hills. So you can kind of see how they'd be two hills, and then if the sun came up between them, how powerful that would be. And a lot of the pylons were also decorated with relief sculpture. It's kind of hard to see, but if you look behind this main statue, you can see that there's carvings on the pylons. So they were carved with the pharaohs like defeating their enemies, or the pharaohs hunting, or all kinds of imagery that promoted the power of the pharaohs or was related to Amun-Re. So here's a model of the Temple of Amun-Re, and you can see this view where you've passed through the Sphinx walkway, you've gone through the first pylon, and you enter into a courtyard. In the courtyard, there's a colonnade, which we learned that word colonnade with Hatshepsut. It's like a row of columns. After that, you would enter through another pylon and into a hypostyle hall. And we learned the term hypostyle hall before, but a hypostyle hall is a room that is held up by pillars or columns. And we're going to see in a minute pictures of those columns. So you have to imagine that if you walked into a hypostyle hall, you would just see columns everywhere. Like the columns actually hold up the roof. So it's not like a totally open room, which you'll see. And one of the things I want you to notice as you look at this model is that as you go deeper and deeper into the tunnel, it gets narrower and narrower. And it's supposed to almost represent like the womb that the earth came out of, like that you're entering into this really, really sacred space as it gets narrower and narrower, and also kind of intimidating till you would eventually get to the sanctuary of the god. Okay, so here's the huge hypostyle hall, which again is a building supported by many columns, and they're between the second and third pylon after you go through the courtyard. Now, today there's no roof, so you can see on the picture on the right that these columns are just in the open air. But here's an illustration of what it would have looked like. And there's another important term here, which is a clerestory. So a clerestory is when you have one part of the roof in the middle raised up. So you can see how the middle part of the roof is raised up, and then there's almost like grates or bars over the window spaces. A clerestory has multiple purposes. Clerestories can be good to let in light, because remember, they don't have electricity or anything at this time. So they can help let in light. They also help with airflow. Okay, so the clerestory is that raised up part. The capitals, which is the top part of a column in this temple, were made to look like lotus flowers. The lotus flowers were supposed to be symbolizing Upper and Lower Egypt. And another thought of it was that it would almost look like reeds or plants like growing out of the Nile. That's kind of like the symbolism that they wanted. You can see these are huge, huge columns. They're 69 feet tall. I like the picture on the right because you can see tourists in there and how small the people are compared to these huge columns. This picture shows the clerestory a little bit better. So you can see how there's like a grate or like a slatted piece of stone over what would be the window area. So that's the clerestory part, the part that's raised above the rest of the building, and that would allow in a little bit of light, but mostly it would really help with airflow. So through this clerestory right down the middle was the main axis of the temple. So again, this is an axial plan. And it's supposed to symbolize like the swamp or the womb from which the earth began. And again, the capitals of the columns were shaped like papyrus or lotus flowers. All of these columns and the walls were very, very highly decorated and carved. So you can see the columns are just like covered in relief carvings. And they would have been brightly painted, which most of that is not left today. Here's another close-up of that does a good job of showing these relief carvings. So we've talked so far about low relief, which is when the images don't stand out that much from the background. We've talked about high relief, where the carvings like really jump out at you from the background. This is what we call sunken relief. So usually we've talked about relief carvings where the structures stand out at us. In this one, they're actually carved into the stone. So you can see it's like the images are sunken into the columns. So this is what we call a sunken relief. Okay, so if you were able to move further and further back into this temple, which first of all, most people couldn't, this was just for the priests or the pharaohs, you would eventually get to the sanctuary of Amun-Re, which is also called the Holy of Holies. So the sanctuary of Amun-Re, or the Holy of Holies. In this area, there would be a statue of Amun-Re, and they had rituals for this statue. So every day, the priests who worked in this temple would wash the statue, like they'd give him a bath. They'd get him fresh clothing. They would offer him food. And so they did everything that you would have to do to like take care of a person. They took care of this statue. And again, that's because they believed that this could be a resting place that Amun-Re would actually come and inhabit. Regular people were not allowed in here. The other thing, so I said it gets narrower and narrower. It got like more raised up. So as you went deeper into the temple, the floor would raise up, which is symbolizing to them the mountain, or again, this swamp or like origin place of the earth, by raising it up as they go. So again, Thebes was the capital, and even though the capital changed over time, this continued to be an important site because there were so many festivals and processions that originated from here. And I just talked about the statue of Amun-Re. They would, again, take the statue of Amun-Re out and parade him around as part of these religious festivals. And so one of the reasons that this continued to be an important site even after the capital was moved is because of this temple and the fact that the pharaohs continued to add to this to show their legitimacy as rulers of Egypt. So for example, here's the Pharaoh Thutmose III smiting his Canaanite enemies on the 7th pylon at Karnak. So they had all of these sculptures created, or these carvings, to show their power and legitimize their rule. Here's another one celebrating the military victory of Ramses II. And so if you have a few takeaways from the Temple of Amun-Re, is that it's a very important site of worship. So its function is as a religious temple, and Amun-Re was one of their most important gods. You should also know that it was added to over time and the reasons why. And then also that it was a major connecting point or starting point of religious festivals. That this is not just like a static place that never was used or just kind of sat there. It was a starting point of these really important festivals celebrating the god Amun-Re.